Thanks for tuning in to the Spread Your Wingspan podcast.
I'm Sarah.
And I'm Jenny.
And we're your hosts, two friends who immediately bonded over our secret smut addictions. So join us as we journey together through our favorite romance and fantasy stories and discuss all things kinks, female pleasure, taboos, and more.
Make sure to check out the show notes for any spoiler alerts and content warnings. We're happy you're here. Let's get to today's pod.
Hi, Jenny.
Good morning, Sarah.
I'm excited to talk about this book with you today.
I'm really excited too because this was a Jenny fave, like an old school Jenny fave. So this was my third reread of this book, and I'm really excited to get your take on it.
I'm excited to talk about it, especially because I think it's the most different from what we've done so far. And it was so cool to read a book that you'd recommended to me, you know, because I'm over here just constantly being like, Jenny, read this, read this.
which I absolutely love. But yeah, it was fun to switch it up for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is definitely the most high fantasy book. In an interesting way. I will get into this later in the outline. I say that and you might be thinking, dragons, wizards, Lord of the Rings. I don't really mean it in that way. But if you're reading a fantasy book and you're like, how do I pronounce these names? What's happening? Whole new system of government to learn?
Do I want a map to understand where all these places are?
And you're like, I'm deeply confused for 300 pages. And you like it, that kind of thing, which I do.
I do too, which I'm so happy. Because on my reread, I was like, oh, I kind of forgot. And, you know, we'll get there. But that, like, this is not smut. This is romance. And definitely I would qualify it as fantasy. But yes, I had kind of forgotten about the slow burn of the political intrigue part of it compared to all the other stuff that we've been reading. I was like, oh,
it takes 400 pages for you to start to understand. It's really prologue for 400 pages.
Yeah. And
then you're like, oh, that's what's going on.
Yeah.
And yes, one of my notes, Jenny, is where is the sex?
Yeah. And I have thoughts about that. We'll get there. We'll stick with that line. Yeah.
Quickly, content warnings. Honestly, there aren't too many, which is surprising given the premise of this book. But you know, there is some mention of a person being harmed, consensually, you know, in a sadomasochistic way. Mm-hmm. I would honestly say, you know, there's murder and death, but that's pretty basic for books. But if that's upsetting to you, content warning for that. I can't really think of any others.
There was one attempted assault that is stopped. So, yes, an attempted assault. And I don't think, like, the murder and death is not described. You're kind of dealing with the aftermath of it. I think that I just want to talk a little bit about how you just said that the first part of the book is basically 300 pages of prologue.
Yes.
And I love that. I am here for it. And we both think that we could probably compare this with a Game of Thrones type of political intrigue build. Not a lot of smut, even though there is some sex in Game of Thrones. It's like, I felt in that book it was really lacking because it wasn't even, it was just kind of like thrown in there. It wasn't
and
even.
it's written by George R. R. Martin.
Yeah, so it's like, but for me, like I may have falsely described this to you as smut, and upon my third reread, I was like, oh, actually, though Phaedra is a courtesan and a spy, she says right from the beginning that her sacred, like, secret keeping is part of her job. And so I was thinking about that this morning, that she declares like she's not going to give us details because also this is a first person story. So we're getting Phaedra's like inner world and she's telling the story. So I wonder if that was just kind of an artful way for the author to be like, yeah, you're going to have to connect those dots. I'm not going to give you details in this book because that's not the important part of this book, though it is I would qualify it as a romance, very much so. She is a courtesan, so she is taking assignations with patrons. But yeah, I didn't really, that wasn't a tickle in my brain the first couple of read-throughs, but upon you're like, where's the smut?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting take on it, you know, and that's fair, and it is absolutely more important her spy work. Mm-hmm. Like, this is a spy novel.
Yes.
First and foremost. And it's a cool one because it's a spy where like everyone's like, are you a spy? You're probably a spy. And she's like, probably. But everyone still tells her. Because that's how good she is in the bed. And that's why it's upsetting to me that I'm like, so show me how she's the best ever.
Fair. Yeah.
So I respect that, but also this book would be improved with some
No disagreement
detailed
from me there.
sex
No
scenes.
disagreement from me
With
there.
specific characters, not with all of them, but there's certain scenes where I was like, oh, I really want to be reading that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Before we get into things, I'm a visual book reader.
And I'm an audiobook listener.
So these are some fun made-up names.
Awesome.
And this book is very French, deeply French. I'm just going to try to rattle off some of what I think these names are, and I need you to correct me now.
Okay.
Will I say them correctly in the podcast? Probably not, but we're going to try. Phaedra no Delaunay.
Phaedra no Delaunay.
Delaunay.
And so when I look at the spelling, I thought there was an R in there. The way the narrator... Delaunay.
Okay. You also said Melisandre.
Which is funny because the way that the narrator says it, it's got that kind of like French, like Melisandre. Like not fully.
Because it's written Melisandre.
Yes. And I remember, I thought of that a few days after we were texting. And I was like, I don't think there's an R in that.
It's not, but there is in Game of Thrones. So I wasn't sure if there was some like wires being crossed.
Probably both and. Yeah.
Alcuin?
Alcuin.
I feel like it should be Alcuin. Okay, Alcuin. Jocelyn.
Yes.
Okay, it's not Jocelyn. It's
Jocelyn.
Okay, Jocelyn. Eloa is the god.
Mm-hmm.
Eloa. Why can't I think of the mentor guy? It's just Delorme. It's not.
Yeah,
what's his first name?
Anafiel.
Anafiel.
Yeah.
Okay, I got that one right. And then obviously Hyacinth is pretty easy. I think those are the main ones. Oh, Valdemar Selig? Is it a V?
Yep.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Is it a W in the book?
Yes.
Yeah, so Valdemar Selig. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then what's the name of the other barbarian guy who's nice?
Oh, the Albin one?
The one who's also a Scaldi, but he's...
Gunther? The one that initially
kicked
Gunther. Yeah, Gunther.
Okay. I think...
Good job.
Alcuin was the main one.
Alcuin, yeah. And hey, I'm just going by the narrator. Who knows if she fact-checked her stuff? I don't know.
Who knows? And it's Dongeline?
Yes.
Okay.
Terdange. Yes.
Okay.
So they're Dongeline.
Okay, you guys, I did better than I thought I was.
Great. That was like an A-.
Thank you.
Good job.
As I said, it helps. I didn't say this on the pod, but I studied French in school, so that helps. This is absolutely like, this book basically takes place in France. I was Wikipediaing afterwards, which I don't usually do. But as I was writing the pod, I was like, I kind of feel like there's context I want to be getting. And it is like supposed to be France, which makes a lot of sense. Like via Crusades kind of is like a vibe going on in this book too. The Castilian Brotherhood. It's all just so very French.
Yes.
In addition to the whole everyone's approach to sex and gender and sexuality.
Agreed.
So French.
Yes.
And
Phaedra is young when we meet her. She's like 8 years old when we meet her, and she knows her mother was a courtesan. And there's a whole thing about her mother having to leave like the night court and all that. But she knows from an early age, her parents basically sell her to one of the pleasure houses in the night court. So she's raised in a brothel.
Yeah.
While there is more of it's part of their culture, there's a respect, like, it's
like a foster system, essentially.
Yeah. And they're pledged to the god Nama, and there's a, rape just doesn't happen because it's heresy. Like, it is an affront and crime to the gods to take the precepts of Nama and Eloa out of, whatever. So, but I find that to be very French is what I mean. Like, just, it's from an early age, she knew she was going to be a courtesan. She was going to be trained and all of this. And, from what I know about history and their approach, and I think that their like legal age of consent, like they're trying to change because it's so young.
I think it's like 14.
I thought it was 12.
Oh,
but I don't know. Like, fact check us, please. But I just remember it
being
like very recently they're trying to change that. And so yes, all of those things to me also makes it very French.
Yes. Synopsis. I did not write this one. I might edit it. It's again from Wikipedia. This novel chronicles the life of Phaedra no Delaunay. From her early years, Phaedra is born with a distinct mark in her eye, a red dot, which initially means she's like hideous, because in Terdange, beauty is equivalent to holiness.
Yes.
And so, especially for a courtesan to have any kind of like physical defect is like, well, unfortunately, you can't be a courtesan. However, it turns out that this mark is Kushiel's dart, which is a very rare mark of a certain specific god or angel. We'll get into that. Kushiel, and it marks her as an anguisette, which means...
Anguisette.
Anguisette. Anguisset makes so much more sense. Anguisset, which means that basically she experiences pain differently than others. It's described as, we will get into this, sexual gratification from pain. I did not feel reading it that was the case.
I have a difference in opinion of that, but we'll get there.
Okay, and then she is eventually acquired by a nobleman, de Lornay, who trains her as a courtesan and a spy. During her service, she uncovers a conspiracy threatening the whole of the kingdom, the whole of her homeland, is eventually at one point put into slavery, travels home, and becomes basically a huge part of the political landscape of her world.
Good. Yeah, that's a good start. I think you would have done better, but it's okay.
I agree.
We'll start here.
Yeah. Anguisset?
Anguisset. And everybody calls her Delornay's Anguisset. Because apparently the red dot in her eye is visible. Like, if we were this close, like, we'd be like, oh my God, you have a red dot in your eye? Which makes me think it was like a giant, like a big...
I was thinking it was like very bright red.
Oh, that would make sense. But it's noticeable. So, it's like, people notice her. And even, like, there's a few instances where there's a mask and people can see her eye. And so
it's very hard for her to hide who she is. So that when people don't know who she is, you're like, what are you doing, friend?
Yeah.
Again, there's some people who be real stupid in this book.
Yes.
Themes.
What
is pain? What is pain's purpose?
Yeah. So you mentioned that her whole red note, she was born experiencing her whole life pain and pleasure in equal measure is how it's described. And so whenever, and they even talk about when she's punished as a child, like she seeks to be bad to get punished because she knows that's going to feel good in her body. Not in a sexual way. She just knows that it's going to feel good in her body. And then, of course, as she grows older and is trained as courtesan, that changes and is taken to fairly extreme levels in this book and in later books. This is the first book in a trilogy, in a series of 3 trilogies that take place in the same world. So how did you decipher that?
I was expecting, when you told me the premise of this book, that when these painful acts were described, I would be told about them from her bodily point of view of that feels good. She frequently describes it as painful. So that was confusing to me because I'm like, well, painfulness feels like painfulness, right? Like, and it's not confusing to me that she enjoys it. She says she enjoys it. But I was expecting it to be more this like physiological transmutation happening where it is more magical, where it is more like it just straight up feels 100% good. And it's more like she just has a real high pain tolerance and is just a pure masochist to me. She's like the purest form of a masochist.
So my take is because she has this behavior seeking punishment and pain, it's more nuanced for me, the way I got it. Like the way that she, throughout the book, there's a character, Melisande, that is a scion of Kushiel. So she's basically from the house that is taught to be the sadist. And then, so to her, Phaedra is like the perfect expression of how she can be a sadist. They're like the perfect match in this way because of the way that she experiences these sensations. So to me, it was more nuanced. Like, I really do, in the descriptions, feel like the more pain she experiences, the more she wants it, and the more pleasure she derives from it. Not always sexually. Like, I feel like the burn is just like, this feels good. And also the way that they're basically indentured servants for the first part of their experience. And all the money that they get from their assignations go to either the courtesan house or, in this case, her foster daddy, for lack of a better word. And then they will also get patron gifts, and those patron gifts are used to mark this tattoo basically up their spine. And once they make their mark, they are freed, and then they can keep all their money and do what they will. And the experience of her getting tattooed, I thought was really interesting because the master tattoo artist keeps like smacking her butt and is like, hold still, Anguisset. She's the first one in 3 generations. So she's very, very rare.
Yes.
So anyway, just from the descriptions of like getting tattooed and her encounters with her patrons, I took it a little differently. Not that, like, that she really does feel them in equal measure.
Well, she also is like notably hornier than other people, which is something. So it does seem like to me, it was more like Dionysian. Like she just is like more sensitive in general. And yeah, absolutely. She has a rebellious spirit. She likes being like She likes testing boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I just felt like I was expecting a much more direct link of deriving pleasure from pain in terms of physical description. That was really missing for me.
Cool.
It was all really described mentally, just like from her. She's like, I liked it. And you're like, did you? Because you were also saying it hurt a lot. And then there are times where she is like literally being hurt in a non-pleasure house way. Like there's scenes where she's like having, you know, her skin flayed from her back and she's like fucking out. Like she's like, this is extremely painful. I'm dying. Like it's not like she's like, oh yes, flay my back some more. And I was kind of expecting that to be the case based on her condition. So yeah, I was interested in my expectation and how that was changed via reading it. But yeah, I thought the whole idea of Kushiel kind of to me became what is pain and what is the purpose of pain.
And he will actually appear before her when she's like really deep in it. Like she
the red
haze. She'll see the red haze and she'll see Kushiel in front of her. And at one point she seeks to be like redeemed at the temple of Kushiel.
Yes. And that is very related to, you know, in deep Christianity, not well practiced, but, you know, self-flagellation as a way to achieve holiness, like self-inflicted pain, either through as atonement or just a way to get closer to God. And Kushiel very much represents that. So pain is absolutely holy in this specific application through Phaedra, which is very interesting to read about. Political machinations, you know, secrets versus truths. That's just this whole book. That's, I think, the most important part of this book is if you like that, you're going to really like this book.
Agreed. And you're going to continue to like the whole series because it just builds and builds and builds.
Who says what around women and why?
Yeah. So women, I think it's an interesting role that women play in the society because some of the intrigue and, you know, royal plots to take down the sovereign, like it's the women trying to do it most of the time. And I don't find that to be the case in most other books like this, but they're involved, the women. And, because I don't know, you're right. You said that people kind of know that she's a spy, but they don't really know because her foster daddy is very much
is a notable spy.
Yes. And like the intrigue and had been involved in something with like the previous generation. And so people revere him. They don't quite trust him unless they're in his close inner circle. And then you realize they have this huge plot that Phaedra's trying to figure out too. Because she's like, what is going on?
Yeah. She's like, what is going on with my daddy, who I love?
Yes.
And want to bone.
Yeah.
That's a whole part of this. They don't bone. They should.
Yeah.
Queen gets there.
Yes.
Yes. I just think it's so interesting that, like, yes, these women are in positions of power. These women are noted as political movers and people to be feared or watch out for. And yet, and this is not just for women because people also speak kind of freely around Alcuin, who's also, what are they? No, not courtesans. What are they called? Adepts.
Adepts, yes.
Adepts?
Well, that's how they say it. Adepts, adepts. I don't think I really have it.
Like, adept.
Yes.
So it's also just like people who says what around people of that profession.
Yes.
Which is what Delarnay is counting on. He purposefully acquires these two children to raise them to be adepts because they'll be such good spies, because people speak freely when they're getting it on. But also people like many of her patrons are like, yeah, what are you doing here? Like, why did he send you? Okay, yeah, let's have sex. Okay, I'll tell you everything. Like,
most of them request her.
That's right, but yeah, but like they know something fishy is going on, but they still like can't quite help themselves.
It's a game. They're all playing.
They literally say Game of Thrones in this book.
Do they?
They say the Game of Thrones in
that's
regards to this. Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. I didn't catch that.
Yeah. Found family. Always a nice part of a fantasy book, or pretty much like a hallmark of the best fantasy books. Hyacinth and Delarnay and Alcuin.
Yeah.
And then, you know, therefore Delarnay's larger circle as well.
Yes. But I do want to pause just for a second. Found family on Hyacinth.
Yes.
So when Phaedra is a small child, she escapes kind of her night court, you know, whatever. Part of it is because she wants to get punished. And part of it is like, I want to see what the world outside is. And so she goes to what is maybe like, I forget what they call it, but Knight's Doorstep. So like she's in the night court, which is like, all the rich people and all of that. And then she goes to, I don't want to call it the slums because that's not how they present it, but it's like working class neighborhood.
Correct.
And she comes upon this boy her age, and they end up like stealing, tarts and and escaping the guards until she gets caught. And then they develop this friendship. And I think that to me, the meeting as children and then being able to maintain a friendship through Phaedra going through this like spycraft training and becoming a courtesan, and he's the Prince of Travelers, which sounds like a very gypsy Romany kind of background.
Yes. And he's having his own journey of becoming kind of an important political player as well within this kind of like working class tier. He's like the Delaunay of that tier. Yes. Which is happening totally separate from Phaedra. And yet they also kind of like support one another in those aims, just inherently through their friendship. There's also vibes.
Total vibes.
They, he's like, I can't be with you. We can't have sex while you still are working on your mark, basically, because it's like forbidden in his culture.
Heresy.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But specifically in his culture, they have a word for it that I don't remember what it is.
Rajna.
Rajna. Yeah. Where it's like
forbidden.
Forbidden. Yeah. But he's like, but when your mark is
and you're free to do as you wish.
She's kind of like, fuck you, dude. Maybe I will. Spoiler alert, they do bone. And it's great. And they're still friends. We'll get into all of that stuff later. Yeah. Loyalty and trust, similar to secrets and truths. I think those go together.
Yeah.
Consent.
That's the big one in this book.
Yes. The layers and variations of consent and how this works in sex work, I found a really cool part of this book because there's absolutely, as you said, as you were right to remember for the content warning, there is moments where Phaedra, there's a total non-consensual encounter that fortunately doesn't come to fruition. When she's enslaved, she is owned by these men, and it's not dissimilar from how she's owned by Delaunay, but it also is very dissimilar. Mm-hmm. So she's consenting, air quotes, because she, in some ways, conditioned to accept that this kind of like enslavement, indentured servitude with her sex work. Mm-hmm. But it's different, and she recognizes that. She's like, I don't want this with these men.
Yeah.
But also she's not traumatized by the encounters in the way that you might expect?
Not in the way that you might expect, because there is some reconciliation that she has to go through after she comes back. But she continues to point out that she's a servant of Nama. Like, she has dedicated herself to this angel goddess. Again, it's still kind of fuzzy to me.
I can explain it later. I researched.
Perfect. But I do think that the Nama, Kushiel, like you've already mentioned, there's a lot of Christian undertone. Deeply Christian. And you can kind of, like, even the Yeshuites,
they're
Jesuits.
Jewish. Yeah.
Yeah. Or, well, so
they have their curls.
No, I think we're conflating two of them, because the Castelline Brotherhood is a Yeshuite sect, but then they refer to the Jewish ones as something else, I think.
Interesting.
Or I might be mixing that up.
Or there's just variations of that culture, and one is more Jewish and one is more Christian.
I think Yeshua is supposed to be Jesus, because they talk about him 100%. Being like...
Okay, let's take a quick tangent. Yeah. This book is pinned on this mythology / religion where Yeshua, Jesus, dies on the cross. Mm-hmm. The Mary Magdalene, cries, and the mixture of his blood and tears births an angel named Elua. Elua is basically a fallen angel because God refuses to recognize Elua as one of his offspring,
right?
Even though it's his grandchild,
right?
Elua and his companions, seemingly other fallen angels, then travel around the earth, basically doing good acts, spreading his message of love as thou wilt. And Nama, okay, because I wasn't sure how to say that one either. It basically performs sex work in exchange for food, lodging, basically whatever they need to survive. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it is seen as extremely holy work because it was done in the service of God's child, basically, even though God did not recognize him as his child.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for solidifying all of that together into one thing.
Oh, also, the people of Terdange are literal descendants. So these angels then literally had kids.
Yes.
And these various territories there's a territory basically per angel, where those are mostly their descendants.
Yes, and that makes up Terdange.
Right, so these people are also kind of like not 100% human.
Mm-hmm. And they talk about that. The reason why Phaedra can take kind of this physical punishment and be, you know, whipped or the flechettes and all of this, she heals very, very quickly.
Because she's got a little angel in
Yeah,
her.
and so they talk about all of them do. And then the, who's Voldemort's,
Valdemar Selig?
their peoples.
The Scaldia? Or the Scaldi?
Yeah, the Scaldi, they, like, the leader of them, which is very, like, Viking to me, they want to mix their blood with the Terdange people because they want some of that god touch blood.
Correct.
So it's very much like they are descended from the god's angels. You know.
Yes.
I'm gonna keep mixing.
We can use them interchangeably. Again, I will get into kind of the more nuances of that in a bit. Back to consent.
Yes, back to consent. Thank you. That's where we were.
Yes.
I have lost my thread. Would you like to pick up the thread?
Yeah. So I just thought it was so interesting that like she describes the layers of consent. And you know where the moment where consent is breached, but you also are like, well, she's consenting inherently, yes, through this enslavement and through her recognition of she's doing this holy service.
Yes.
But it's not her choice.
Right.
So there's consent, and then there's consent plus choice, which is a very interesting nuance.
Yes, because she talks about, this is where I was leading before our tangent, which was very valuable. Her continuing to remind herself that she is Nama's servant and that she dedicated herself in the temple of Nama, and the way that Nama suffered in service, it was very much the story of Nama being in service in order to get food, selling her body, was, I found to be a story of suffering. She did it in service, but it was a story of suffering. So for Phaedra to be an Anguisset and have this whole pain pleasure thing, she is able to, I think, mentally give herself permission to willingly put herself in situations that she knows will be of service to others. So she, while it's not full consent, she has also taken a vow to suffer in this way. And on the flip side, she's also taken this vow to offer pleasure in this way. So it, to me, very much it is an expression of this Nama servant.
Yes.
And so, yes, while she is enslaved, she does go as willingly as one can go under this kind of guise of who she is to her master.
Yes. And she recognizes that that's the main tool in her toolbox to survive and to try to figure out a way out.
Yes.
So in that way, it is, again, very consensual because she's actively engaging in this for her own good in a lot of ways as well.
And the good of her kingdom.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But then, you know, there's the consent of she is given these assignations or assignments to these various patrons, and it's consensual because she wants to do this work and again serves to Nama, but she is not choosing them. Her master Jelorna is choosing them most of the time, and she agrees. He's like, "Do you want to do this?" And she's like, "Yes, please."
She does have the option to say no.
Absolutely, yes. That's what I mean. She's like, "Yeah, let's for sure. This one's good." But notably, she has sex with two characters of her own free will. And she remarks on how different it is when it is her 100% choice, which to me is like, that's the purest form of consent in this book. So again, like there's a lot of types of consent, and like it kind of like layers, scale down, and then there's no consent on the other side.
Yes, because I do remember when she and Jacqueline finally have sex, he doesn't realize until after the fact. He was curious. He didn't know if she could experience pleasure without pain. Because there's no punishment, there's no pain, there's just this, and though it is not described in as much detail as some of us would like.
Awful, you guys.
Well, I mean, the text isn't awful, the lack of description is awful.
The lack of description is awful.
But it's a very sweet, and she says, like, it was the first time she came to it of her own free will, and then Jocelyn very just, like, kind of meekly is like, I didn't know if you needed me to punish you in order to feel that, and she said, no, I don't. And so I think maybe we also don't quite realize that, because every single encounter she has before that is an assignation, does have a sort of punishment element to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, because before she's given these specific ways to enact sexuality that are almost predetermined based on what the person is asking of her. And in these cases, she's able to freely express her sexuality. Not 100% because she would like Jocelyn to hurt her. Which becomes a thing.
But he's a priest. We got another priest in this book.
He is a sexy samurai priest.
Gasoline.
Religion and history. Again, we got into that a little bit already. Love as Thou Wilt, which is Elua's, edict and message, which is great. And it very much makes sense with this courtesan culture and these various ways of experiencing pleasure. Kind of these different houses of courtesans are broken up into different types of pleasure. And again, it's seen as holy to love as Thou Wilt. And that also includes, babies, everyone is pansexual in this book. Literally
everybody.
Everyone. Could I be happier about that? No. It's so great. It is so normalizing. I wish all homophobes, maybe not hardcore homophobes, people who are a little bit homophobic could read this and be like, oh, it's just normal.
Yeah.
This is what it's like when it's not that nobody cares. It's that's the norm. Yeah.
It doesn't even really need to be talked about because love as Thou Wilt is what everybody says.
That's the whole point.
That is mentioned all throughout the book. And in Phaedra and Jacqueline falling in love, Jacqueline has taken a vow of not just celibacy, but he is a priest. He is a warrior priest. He is a very hard nut to crack. And I hated him the first time I read this book. He's a stick in the
mud, my friend.
The first time I read this book, I was like, Jacqueline.
You hated him?
I hated him. I was like,
I just laughed at him all the time.
Well, because I think I love spy courtesans. Come on, could a character be any better than that? And I do think that this one does it well. Well, you say it's 300 pages of prologue. I'm give me all the prologue. Give me portrayal. Give me all of that.
I enjoyed it.
I almost want more of it. I love that part. I love the building up. And then Jocelyn comes in and he's just
he sucks kind of.
Anyway, but for her to be a courtesan who has this who's an Anguset, this pain pleasure thing, to then encounter Jocelyn, and he is sworn to serve and protect her.
He's basically the exact opposite.
The exact opposite.
Yeah.
And then the way that they kind of slowly do this dance to come
to love her.
There is. And then, in the end, his, not master, but the head of his sect. His order is you have to come atone, and you can't go on this adventure and protect her. No, you're a
bad boy.
Yeah, you're a bad boy, and your first, loyalty should be to us. And then he swears he asks the queen if she will take his, service instead. And she basically says yes, because Ella says love is Thou Wilt. She's a homegirl.
And she also knows that he and Phaedra are deeply in love.
Yes. But then he's declared anathema because he breaks his vows. And for a while, he's very upset there.
I mean, the angst. Jocelyn is the character that holds all the angst in this book.
Yes, all of it.
He is the wah-wah version of Tyler Bell. In Priest, where he's breaking his vows and he's shit, dude. And he's but it feels so good and I love it. And Jocelyn's breaking his vows and he's oh no.
He's constantly trying to give up his weapons. He's I'm not worthy.
I suck now. Don't you realize? Punish me. And everyone's you're good, bro. Love. Yeah. Oh, Jocelyn.
Yeah, so I hated him upon first reading.
That's hilarious.
I have now, talking about when what's going to happen in a book, I give him more latitude now on rereads because I also know where he's going, and I also know where let
me tell a little story about how paragraphs into my introduction to Jocelyn, I texted Jenny, and I don't know if you knew this is how early I said
No,
this.
I had no clue.
I had just met him, and I was he and Phaedra are gonna fuck.
What are they gonna do?
I was I need these two characters to fuck, and Jenny just wrote LOL, and I was I think that means they do. I think that means I'm right. It either means I'm hilariously wrong or 100% right. And so then reading it, I was I know where this is gonna go.
Yeah, I thought you were way further on in the book when you said that.
No, I literally, he showed up and he was guess you hate the Castelline Brotherhood, huh? I'm a real Castelline. I'm the most Castelline. And I was oh, they're going to bone each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a pretty clear, we know where this is headed.
Final theme, sadomasochism, which we talked about.
We did talk about that.
Yeah. Okay. I already talked about how it's so French.
Yes.
The angels.
Yes.
Getting into this. Okay, so this again, I got a little bit from Wikipedia. And when I realized that that's what this was, I was oh shit. So there is a part in the Bible that says the sons of God coming into the daughters of men. And basically there's an interpretation of the Bible about this where then this other subset of angel is born from that. Basically, angels were fucking like crazy in the book, and God got really mad. I'm talking about the book being the Bible. God got so mad and like scourged these half angels from the earth. They were seen as like monsters. Yes.
Were they fucking each other or fucking humans?
Humans.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for clarifying.
So these are half human, half angels. And they are like that's like an abomination to God. God is like, that was not my plan, angels. But angels were like, these human women be hot.
Yeah.
and we assume men.
Yes.
The Georgia Kincaid series, which I told you about very early in our friendship, which is the first book is Succubus Blues. It's about a succubus.
Love a succubus.
Is based on this premise as well.
Oh,
cool. 100% based on this premise as well. So basically, Elua and his companions are these or the people of Terdange are these offspring of the sons of God coming into the daughters of men.
Got it.
And the author read this in the Bible and was like, I want to write about this. And that's where this whole story came from.
Juicy. Love
yes.
That. So it makes sense that there's all these biblical references and you know,
so Christian.
We can, as you read it, if you are familiar at all with the Christian pantheon, if that's the right word, you can kind of tell like who's based on who, which I think gives a good anchor point. Not that, and please don't take this as like the Christian gods and stories are like the be all and end all. Just as somebody who was raised Christian, reading this, I was like, oh, I kind of see what we're up to here.
Yes, but it's also very interesting because it's a very like heretical type of Christianity. It's almost like a pagan version of Christianity because there's multiple gods that are prayed to. And so it's kind of like Christianity in an alternate universe where it's not monotheistic, even though there is like a one God reference, like the God, you know, but they kind of don't worry about that God at all. They pay all of their homage and attention to Elua and the companions, which is you know, similar to many other religions and not Christianity.
True.
You know, it reminds me more of like Hinduism, perhaps.
Yes. Or any of the polytheistic religions.
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's so cool. So if you're geeked out by any of these things, you will deeply enjoy this.
Agreed.
Yeah. I wish the smut was smuttier. We've talked about this.
Yes.
I mentioned, so I got the sense that Phaedra was more getting high or drugged from pain than aroused.
Yeah, I would love to talk about this because when I read this in the fabulous outline that Sara always writes like weeks before we're recording because she's on it, I was like, oh, that wasn't the perspective I got. And then, so Sara read this before I did, and then I did another reread to prepare for the pod. And so I'm like super fresh on the content. Yeah. And so I was thinking about this morning, and while I didn't really agree with this when I read this, based on our conversation so far, here's my take on this. Because there's this like redemption seeking behavior that Phaedra has through her expression of pain and pleasure, I wonder if the relief that she gets from being punished is more like, you know, let's just get to it. Not that orgasm is always the end goal of every sexual encounter.
I see where you're going.
I think that she does talk about this in her encounters and in her like ultimate Melisande assignation, the way that is expressed.
Yes.
Melisande basically wants her to give her signal, her safe word, which is written into a contract, guys, which I love. Like, again, it's heresy.
The consent
it's heresy to go too far. I love this scene.
Where she says Hyacinth.
Yeah, where Melisande forces her to say
and she comes
and then she immediately has an orgasm. So that's why for me, I was like, yeah, this is definitely sexual. But hold on, just let me wrap up my thoughts. So, but when after she comes back from the Scaldi and feels like she needs to be cleansed of everything that happened, and she goes to Kushiel's temple and they essentially flog her and she's bleeding and then they throw salt water on her, which, oh man. But that kind of relief, I do feel like that part was a balm. And that does to me feel like, oh, she needed to be sedated, medicated, drugged. Yes, that does make sense to me.
Okay. I love what you're saying. And you're giving me new thoughts too. To me, it's less that the pain is the orgasm and more that it's the after the orgasm.
Got it.
The intense relaxation and like, because the red haze that's described, like, it kind of fogs her brain. It kind of, like, she sometimes blacks out a little, loses consciousness, or loses time, hallucinates, like, and that's what's described when she's experiencing pain. So I'm like, this to me is like a girl is getting high. But in that way, that's very reminiscent of post-orgasm haze.
Yes.
So when you mentioned that, I'm like, okay, yes, connective tissue. She absolutely still comes, like, very easily and often, which is a funny part of the book, because there's several guys that are like, she'd be coming all the time, and she's like, she's like, it's my condition. I was like, I can't not.
Yeah, I can't.
But, like, good for you, I guess. Yeah. You're pretty bad in the sack. So it's less about that high and more about the come down.
Interesting. Cool. I love it. I think it's a great take.
Your reread thoughts, which you've sort of alluded to often already, but I want to hear the condensed.
Yeah, so I think that this is one of the book series I will continue to read for the rest of my life. I think, there's Throne of Glass for you. Well, I love Throne of Glass, and I do actually need a reread when I have time.
Yes, you do.
I would consider this book series my Throne of Glass, just like the level of I will read this periodically throughout my life. Love it. I couldn't pinpoint. I want to say maybe I did reread this during the pandemic, during lockdown, because I was like, I just need to comfort something. So that was 4 years ago. There were details of this that I had already forgotten, which I think is a lovely thing about being such a voracious reader, is like, you can only really keep so many details. So some of it does leave my brain, and then I know generally where it's going. Some of the details I had forgotten. And so I was, there's a lot of details. And you also, as I was reading, I texted Sarah and was like, oh, I'm so glad I'm rereading this. And you had said, like, I bet that upon reread, you get to connect more of the, like, political intrigue.
Oh my gosh.
And that was what was happening. The characters are more familiar. And because when there is political intrigue, and their names to me kind of, since they're all French, they kind of do start to blend together. And I'm like, oh yeah, who's who? So
they're all are related, and so they share surnames.
Yeah. And that is also a drawback from listening, is I don't have the words in front of me. And so it does get a little complicated, especially in fantasy and sci-fi, when
I could not have listened to this one.
Yeah. Editing this transcript is going to be a pain in the butt, people, but I will do it for you. Yeah. So this is one of the first books, and I may have missold this to you because we had been reading so much smut. To me, what I remembered in my brain was like kinky stuff, very basic. But as I was reading it, I'm like, Sarah's going to hate the lack of that description in it. But it was one of the first books that I was like, whoa, this is sex work is holy. Phaedra's very being is something that doesn't exist in real life. I mean, like, her just physiology dictating her experience. So I was like, whoa, this is really interesting. And then given the political intrigue, and I love the character of Melisande. I love her. She is my dark Scorpio alter ego. Like, she is just like the scion of, like, sadism.
She's an uber bitch.
She's an uber bitch, but she's like gorgeous and is able
so smart,
and just like, I love her.
And so powerful. She's so powerful.
Oh,
and she knows it, and she, like, gets off on that because she's a sadist.
Yes.
Like, but then that permeates her whole character.
Yes, she is the embodiment of, like, everything my dark inner world wishes I could be.
Yes, I love that. It's this great foil for especially women of, like, what if you could truly be this most powerfully awful self? Yeah.
Melisande Sharazai, and just that fucking name, people. Like, I literally get goosebumps thinking about her. I love her. So talking about, like, escapism and all of that, this checks all the boxes for me. I think those are all my thoughts in my reread, but now I'm curious, do you have any interest to read the next 2 books to complete the trilogy?
No. Okay. Yeah, probably not.
Yeah.
While I enjoyed it, I was not drawn in enough by the plot is interesting, and it ends on a cliffhanger. The cliffhanger being like, there's somebody we can't trust in our inner circle. And it wasn't enough for me to be like, I have to find out who that is. Which would be, I think, the hook to get you to keep reading. So I may, but because there's so many other books out there in the world, it would be kind of thing where potentially I reread this down the line and then I'm like, oh, I do want to find out what happens. And also, again, this is a hefty book. So this was enjoyable, but I would in no way describe this as like a real pleasure read. This was a read that required work and attention.
Fair.
And so I want to be able to like really pay attention, in the same way of Game of Thrones, like, again, like, people might see that and be like, oh, a beach read. It's absolutely not. Like, if you're reading Game of Thrones, I think you have to like really pay attention or you're going to miss crucial stuff. It's like missing a step in math class. And like, you're like, I can never solve this equation. You could miss just one sentence a teacher says and you suddenly don't understand anything in the whole class. And these books are really similar to that. So this is, I think, more generous than Game of Thrones. I think in Game of Thrones, it's like even more like if you miss something, you miss something. Because this narrator, she does kind of like she helps you. Yeah. She's like, remember when I mentioned that earlier? Kind of. Yeah. But it still is like you have to do work as a reader to like really hold a lot of this information in your brain. And so for me, that's something I'm like very consciously opting into rather than like, oh, I have to keep reading.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Well, then I might, at some point, if you don't want to reread it, tell you what happens. Because I think that the juicy intrigue comes together and Melisandre, like what happens. Yeah. It's really good. So I get it. You're curious about how it ends, but not enough to slog through 2 more 900-page books.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well wrapped up. Okay. So a funny thought I had while reading, I'm like, is this fantasy?
I have thoughts about this, but
so it definitely is.
Yes.
Britannica qualifies fantasy as imaginative fiction dependent for effect on the strangeness of settings, such as other worlds or times. This is taking place in another world and time.
Yes.
There we go. But it's not very, I think a lot of time I think about fantasy as very magical. And while, again, there is, like, she is got this ability, this condition, it's slightly not human, but it's not really experienced magically. Hyacinth has some like magical quote unquote properties, but they're very much like situated in like this kind of gypsy fortune teller thing that already exists in our world, where he can basically portend to the future. And then there is this god. I called him the god of the river, and Jenny was like, the master of the streets.
Just trying to stay true to what was written.
No, I love it, but it was very funny.
Well, you said the god of the river, and I was like, the master of the streets.
Correct. There is this like embodiment of this body of water that controls the body of water. That is not a human. It is a god. It is like
the waves are
mythological being. But almost in this way, kind of like Noah's Ark, and again, like kind of early Bible, like things are described this way, and then it's like, well, it was just a really bad storm, actually. It kind of has that vibe of like, is it actually a dude in the tower? So it's kind of both and. Yeah. So it definitely is fantasy, and again, I said it has the high fantasy qualification of it's dense. You have to learn a whole new culture, a new language, new geography, like new religion, like all this stuff in the way that I think like, people who think about like geekiest high fantasy, that's what they think of. Yeah. Which I love.
Yes. So, which brings me to one thing I want to mention. I was like, when was this published? So this book was published in 2001, June 23rd, 2001. Game of Thrones, the first one came out August 1st, 1996. So we're talking about 20 to 30 years ago that both of these books were published. 2 points. One, I think the fantasy, and if we even call those both high fantasy for all the reasons you just said, they wrote them differently 20 to 30 years ago.
Yes.
There was not a lot of smutty scenes in the fantasy then. Yeah. We now consuming fantasy, and I love is this the actual term, blockbuster fantasy? Like ACOTAR? Is that the term?
That's what I called it.
And I was like, oh, is that actually the term? Because it's such a great way of describing it, because it's like, I can't say I like, if I had to pick one, I actually think I would like the Kushiel's Dart Game of Thrones type of fantasy over the ACOTAR fantasy if I had to choose one. We don't have to choose one. We can read it all.
I could
But the things that I like that I found I almost want more of in ACOTAR. Not Throne of Glass, because I think Throne of Glass
has it more.
It has it more.
Especially in Tower of Dawn, you guys, which is a good book. Hot take.
Yes, great book. So just thinking about like what makes fantasy. Yes, we can define fantasy, but I also kind of think that I need to start qualifying when fantasy was written as the type of fantasy too.
I think you will like From Blood and Ash.
Yes, very excited. That's my next.
Because it has a little bit more of that world building.
Yeah. So
world building, it's really it's details. It's information. Mm-hmm. It's like a VR headset where you're sitting and you're looking around and the story is happening, but you're also periodically like looking around and really taking it in.
Oh my God, somebody should make that. Somebody, guys, if you're in like the AI VR world, please, for the love of God, give us all of these great worlds that we can just walk around and explore. Yes. That would be incredible.
But that's what I think the best this high fantasy does is like a lot of this book is just describing things that aren't central to the plot in any way, but they also are because you need that information to get a bigger picture, right? It's like adding detail to the paintings.
Yes.
So you can get close up and like see everything very clearly, right?
Yeah.
It's so awful when you read a book and you're like, I can't picture this at all.
Yeah, where are they?
How did I get here? What position are their arms in right now? Like bad description in that way can be a real deterrent.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay.
So yes, I do think this qualifies as fantasy of written in a particular time.
But if you're going to it expecting like again
an ACOTAR
magical crystals and wizards and dragons and things that fly and like it's not that. It's much more. This is a different world, and you're reading deeply about the intense political machinations in this world.
Yes, I might be remembering this wrong, but I do think the third trilogy in the series of 3 trilogies does have more magic. Don't quote me on it.
Fascinating.
I will eventually reread all of these again. Sarah, might take me a year. I will let you know. But I think there's a plot point. I might also be mixing up book series because that also happens. But I do think that the third one, which happens generations later, I do think that there is actually more magic. I'm thinking dragons. I could be totally making that up.
Fascinating.
But I don't remember. So now I'm going to have to really
that would be very interesting.
Yeah. And if it's not, then I'm going to have to figure out what series I'm thinking of because that is an excellent trilogy.
Because I want to read that too. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so this is definitely much more romance than smut. I agree with you. Yes. Although again, the romance it's light. Like it is central to the plot and it is very satisfying to read. Again, I had no problem. Jocelyn, I hated and loved him at the same time. Like I had no problem being like, oh, basically I was like, this naive idiot doesn't understand himself or the world at all. And has the conviction of a white man being like, I understand the world perfectly, thank you very much. Yes. And you're like, my dude, you do not. So it's kind of like it's really funny because he kind of reminds me of the male character in the book that I'm writing, where I frequently am writing his point of view and I'm like, you're such an idiot.
Thank you, dear author, for staying true to your characters.
You're just like, oh, you. And I kind of had that with Jocelyn where I wasn't like angered by him, but I was like, this guy. But then he does also really surprise you in a few moments. And I thought his arc was so satisfying where he basically discovers that within himself, even though almost like in Angeset, it causes him pain constantly, he feels his loyalty is best served to Phaedra and his constant breaking of his vow to be loyal to Phaedra is his like holy path. Yeah. Even though it is inherently unholy according to how he was raised and it just destroys him on the inside. You know, that's very interesting and kind of gorgeous from a love story point of view. Yeah. And then from Phaedra's point of view, he is never ever going to hurt her, which he says at one point. He's like, my girl, I could never hurt you. And she's like, I know, buddy. That's okay.
With a headbutt, it's okay.
Yeah, he's a little puppy dog with swords.
Yes. And van braces.
It's like, what's happening? And for both of them, they're kind of like in being together, they're recognizing that this is not going to be like a painless and not pain in the good way, pain in the emotional torture way. Yeah. But like that, they can't imagine life without each other, which is, chef's kiss. Yes. Yeah. It's good stuff. It's got the right amount of tension, but also you don't worry I was like never worried that they weren't going to be together.
Yeah. And I do think, you know, in jokingly saying thank you, author, for staying true to your characters, I do think that the way that the plot develops, they are both they can in no way veer from who they are as people.
And they never ask each other to.
Correct.
Which is, again, lovely. They're very accepting of who each other is, even though the other person's inherent personality causes them inherent
Yeah, they're
pain.
almost in direct... When they first meet, they are in direct conflict to who they are.
Yes.
And then they do eventually find a way to be together.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And again, it helps that this is a very sex positive society. And there's a few times in the book where Phaedra goes to have sex with somebody else and Jocelyn's like shrugs, or he's like, okay, bud.
Yeah.
Like he's like nods, and he's like, and they made no promises to each other. So she doesn't even need to check in with him, but she kind of does because he's so straight laced, I think, and because she cares about him. And so I get the vibe going forward. The book kind of ends where she like is like, oh, I think I have to start, you know, doing the sex work again for these political reasons. And Jocelyn's like, here we go again.
Yeah.
So I get the vibe that like they stay together, but then she continues to have these more painful sexual experiences outside of their union. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Which is interesting.
It's very interesting.
What an interesting version of a love story.
Yeah. Love as Thou Wilt.
Love as Thou Wilt.
Yeah.
Yeah. By pan representation. We talked about it a little bit.
Here for all of it.
Don't know more to say other than, again, it's really satisfying to read a book where literally every character, and obviously some have more preference than others, but like every character goes anyway.
Yeah.
Not just both ways. It's like anyway.
Yeah.
And not that there's a lot of non-binary representation in these books. It is very gender, like, you know,
Normative.
Men and women, yeah, gender normative. But you get the sense that like if she wrote these books now, there would be non-binary characters and trans characters and everybody be fucking everybody still.
I would agree.
So I think it's just like of the time, there was less understanding of pansexuality.
Yeah.
But everybody is pansexual. Yeah. And it's so good.
Yes, I agree.
So good. Do we want to talk about this last point?
We kind of did a little bit.
It is interesting to have a Christian holy figure who's a woman who is not, you know, in our Christianity, the Virgin Mary, and then Mary Magdalene, who's seen as... By the way, we don't even know who this poor Mary Magdalene even was, but it's like, oh, the whore who washed Jesus' feet and like hate her. And then the Virgin Mary, his mother, like holiest. Yeah. And so to have this character that's kind of like both of those, and like her being a whore, and I say that word lightly in this case, being a sex worker, is what makes her so holy. Again, we have talked about this already, but that is delightful to read from a feminist perspective.
Agreed. And all of that, so I also am realizing now as we're talking, like Kushiel, like all of the houses of the Night Court are in service to Nama.
She is like the ultimate companion.
She's like the ultimate Eloa's companion, one of Eloa's companions. And then each house is like a different kind of, they're not true descendants like in the sense that they're like children of Nama, but it's like she's kind of the overarching, all of the courtesans dedicate themselves to the service of Nama. Yeah. In individual temples to different angels.
Different versions of her.
Yeah.
Yes.
So her like she's almost in this case like placed above how Mary Magdalene is placed.
Oh yes. She's more on the Virgin Mary level.
Yeah.
Like if you think of Catholicism, like Virgin Mary, the Mary and Jesus, like she's not at Jesus's level, but she's much closer to.
Yeah.
And so like people pray to Mary specifically, right? So yeah, I think it's definitely, she is, even for some, maybe a more important figure than Eloa.
I would agree. Especially for Phaedra in the courtesans in the Night Court.
Yeah. Yeah. This idea of devotion to those you love. Really, it's because Eloa is like, love as Thou Wilt, and Nama is like, I devote myself to that love.
Yes.
And so that is, that's extremely holy, even just as an idea.
Yeah.
I wrote in my notes, honestly, where would the world be without sex work? This book,
I mean, like, I read that and I was like, yeah, you're right. History has shown the oldest profession.
Yeah.
You know, I would love to hear more, but like.
No, that was my conclusion after reading this, is like, when you read it from this lens, where it really is seen as this integral part of society, and it's not even that there's no shame. It's like, it wouldn't even occur to you. And like, there is it's so sacred and it's so valued, and versus our existence where it's the opposite, right? And the value is recognized, but it's always tinged. And that if sex work was actually elevated to what it actually can be and does, it's like recognizing like the world as we know it wouldn't exist without this.
Yes.
We just don't recognize it. And that's kind of just, it was not the biggest revelation I had, but it was really a takeaway that popped into my head after reading this.
Yeah, because how often do we get a book from this lens where the courtesans are revered, they're holy, they're able to make their own choices within the limits of, you know, this indentured servitude, basically. Yeah.
And it's, honestly, it's very little of it is like about sex in this book.
It's true.
So the salaciousness is removed.
Yeah, and it's more about the beauty. And they are
like
all...
the honor, like the honor, devotion, loyalty, companionship, service.
Yeah.
Much more than like, I don't know, like
making it the secret thing that you can't talk about and that you have to kind of like whisper, like
bodily functions and like sounds and noises and textures and like, I don't know, like the kind of like more animalistic aspect of sex.
Yeah, it's true. I think that because the whole approach to life in Terre d'Ange is to seek beauty and to be beauty. And beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It's not that they all seek to emulate beauty in their own way.
Yes. And they recognize different kinds of beauty.
Yes.
But they're very hoity-toity. It's very French.
There's also a hierarchy of class here. Let's not be, remiss.
Like, oh, it's too bad you're not beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, there are servants to the nobility and like all of that is happening, but it's not discussed as like the servants are looked down on or anything.
No,
I'm just realizing in this book, like even never mind the courtesans as servants of Nama, but like even the
actual servants,
they're members of the household. They are referred to,
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Anything else?
I don't think so.
This is a meaty one.
This was a meaty one. I mean, it's a very dense book.
Yeah.
Do you want to give our ratings?
Sure. Well, I've noted that this is one of my top series that I love. Also, guys, I play Dungeons and Dragons, and my character's name is Phaedra because of this. But I don't spell it the same way because she is an ill luck named child.
Yes.
The way that it's spelled, so I do spell it differently. And not that my character is a courtesan spy, but I just was trying to think of what would I name like a true fantasy character, and I was like, oh, Phaedra.
So good.
So it's really fun. Every Monday night, my friends call me Phaedra, and it's a blast. I love it.
So is this like a 10 for you?
This is, I would put the whole series as a 10. This book on its own, to me, is like an 8.5. But the series as a whole, the trilogy, and then like the 3 trilogies, I would put as a 10 for just like well thought out individual books, continuation of story. Like the fact that there's a trilogy, and then there's another trilogy, and then there's another trilogy.
Yeah, I love that.
I thought it was very artfully written.
Yeah?
Yeah.
For me, it's a 7. Where it's above Marvelous Light, which we just read. And I enjoyed it. But it's definitely not to me that it was like my most amazing. Again, I did ultimately really enjoy it, but it's not in that like top tier to me.
You have to work for this book.
You do. And again, if I had read, it was like, when you're reading what Lorcan did, and you're like, what did he do? Yeah. I'm like, describe Jocelyn's penis to me. What did it feel like inside of her body? I need to know.
7, if there had been smutty smuts.
It would be an 8 or an 8.5.
Cool.
Depends how good it was written.
Hopefully an 8.5.
Hopefully an 8.5. So, spice level, it's not a green bell pepper because the door doesn't close, but it's pretty close to a green bell pepper, you guys. It's like, basically, this is what the sex scenes are like. And then I gave him a blowjob.
No, she performed the Languissement.
Oh, Languissement?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I was reading as Languissement. So but that means blowjob. And so it's basically like, I gave him a blowjob.
But let's use a euphemism in another language not to fully describe it.
Exactly, yeah. I prefer Languissement.
Yeah.
He sliced my side open the next day. Like that's, and then it's like, and then the next day happens. Like it's these really brief, he hit me in the face, and then I realized he wanted me to open his breeches, so I did. And then I performed the Languissement. Like those, so it's like the tiniest bite of a red pepper.
Yeah. But the S&M stuff, I would maybe elevate it to Two Peppers, because not everybody is going to want to read about the pain. Just thinking about
even that is not really described very much.
fléchettes, or I mean, there are some where he's
I suppose.
yeah, it's the fléchettes.
Yeah, when she gets cut, but
yeah. I'm just saying, if we're trying to be,
but that's not sexual. It's like it's so written as not sexual. Like I've read a lot of BDSM, as you know, and like it's in sex scenes. It's in these scenes, and in this book, it's like you're just like, and he's cutting your skin. Like I don't know, so I wouldn't even say pepper is the appropriate. I would say it's more content warning than like the spice rating.
Guys, Sarah has reached a new level of rating her peppers. I think she has become desensitized to some content in books, and this is okay.
I need a non-pepper scale. I need something else.
You're right. You make a good point. Yeah. Even though they are technically intertwined.
Yeah. It's a taboo staircase. Yeah. And on the taboo staircase, it's halfway up the stairs. Is it sexual? No.
No, I would disagree.
Is that the right way? Okay.
That's okay. That's okay. We are different people. We have different opinions.
Yeah.
The taboo staircase.
Another top of the dome.
Another graphic I have to make for us. Staircase of taboo.
Oh, all right. Okay. So next week, what are we talking about?
Well, I don't want to say, because we might be switching up our orders. Okay. So, this is what happens when you try to plan ahead. Best laid plans. We're still rolling with it. But I do think next I am going to read From Blood and Ash.
So excited.
So I think we might be, I'm getting lost on when we're actually recording this and when we're going to be releasing it. But I think next we're going to record From Blood and Ash.
Amazing. I really don't want to give too much away.
Don't.
But I want to say something.
One thing.
This is becoming a very Christian podcast, and I will leave it at that, which is really interesting. Really interesting, and I think worthy of, again, and maybe another master's thesis. But yeah. Cool. Planting that in your dome.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thanks for tuning in, guys.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Spread Your Wingspan podcast.
We would love to hear what you think about our topics today. Be sure to connect with us on Instagram and subscribe to our YouTube channel.
You can find us on both with the handle @SpreadYourWingspan, and all the links and more fun stuff are found on our website, spreadyourwingspan.com.
And if you have a book or author you want us to check out, send us an email at hello@spreadyourwingspan.com to tell us.
We hope you tune into the next episode.